Hi, so WoW Classic demo out, and I had a little play with Paladin, of course. I tried to recreate my Paladin as it was, or as I created it back in May 2005. It's quite a long time ago. Can't remember all the details, but I'm pretty sure I recreated it perfectly, as far as I can recall. So what I also did is have a little play on it. I thought I'd go through some of my thoughts as to recalling how it used to be leveling up and then playing at endgame with my Paladin from the Ret point of view back in vanilla, but also how I'm likely to approach it when WoW Classic does launch in summer of 2019. So here we are in the Classic WoW demo on my, I suppose I could call it a Retribution Paladin. I've spent talent points in Retribution. We'll look at the talents in a moment. In terms of the DPS, you could argue, well, you're not going to see very much of a level 16 here. In fact, that's the wrong seal. Let's take that off. But in fact, what I'm doing here is Seal of the Crusader, which as a damage seal is not the best option I can choose, but it can debuff the enemy. So it takes extra holy power. Then I use a different seal, which then does holy damage, and that debuff, the Judgment of the Crusader, will do extra damage. But whenever I use Judgment, I've got to reseal, and that's the thing as well, is, oh, got full bags, there we go, is that you're constantly moving around like this. It can cause a little bit of an issue with mana. As people have pointed out, the mana regen's a bit better than it used to be at the time. I certainly used to do a lot more auto-attacking back then. But it is this cycle of you judge it with something, like a debuff to begin with, and then adopt a more DPS type seal, and then judge when you can. But whenever you judge, you have to reseal. And this happened in TBC as well, of course. And that's it. And it doesn't get any more, you know, complicated level cap. Now, a lot of people describe Retribution Paladins as no point DPS. You know, you were healers in vanilla. And this is both true and not true. It all depends on exactly what you mean. Now, in terms of the damage a Retribution Paladin could do, it was actually pretty decent. But you had to bear in mind a few things. The rotation, of course, was pretty much non-existent. It was very basic. As I've just alluded to there, it gets no more complicated. However, there were a few things to bear in mind. It was mostly based around vengeance as well, you could argue. So this is a nerfed form as well, because this Classic demo, as Classic WoW will be when it launches next summer, was based on the later patch. But earlier on, this used to do like 5% and stacked up to 3 times. It doesn't actually say here that it stacks at all. I'm just trying to look. It's 3% bonus. There's 5 talent points to put into it. So I'm thinking at this point, it's the patch where it didn't stack at all. It just happened once. Is that right? I can't obviously test it. But the way it works is it works off a crit. So it's a bit like, okay, every time you crit, you're going to get that buff for 8 seconds. That's nice. No, you made sure that it would be up all the time. And the way you did that is by maintaining a certain level of crit. You know, around about 20%, I think, used to do. And that way you would crit very early on and, you know, stack it up when it needed stacking up. And then, you could just keep it up all the time. And the difference between someone who didn't have much crit and therefore wouldn't maintain it a lot, and particularly, as I say, when it stacks, it was very important to not just have it proc, but have it stack up to 3 times and maintain, was quite significant. And sometimes, you know, that's what led to it. However, in the early days of vanilla, a big problem was blessings. You can see here, this blessing, which I can put on myself, only lasts 5 minutes. And you had to bless everyone in the raid every 5 minutes. And there were so many blessings, it wasn't just like, oh, you bless this party, you bless this party. You know, each paladin pretty much had to do 40 people if you wanted to make best use of the blessings. So what you would end up with is a situation, first of all, where you did have Rets in there, but even though still healing, because at the bottom of the Retribution tree was Blessing of Kings. Now, it's not at the point at which this is set, because that's much further up now, so anyone can get access to this to a reasonable degree. However, The problem of this having to buff 40 people every 5 minutes also went away. So when Classic WoW comes out, we will have access at higher level than this, but certainly by level cap, to the greater blessings. So we will be able to actually buff the raid quite easily, and then we could focus on DPS, and that would actually be okay. But then there's a second problem, and this is why, in reality, it is very likely... You know, I will level up as a Retribution Paladin, but I'm going to be honest, if I decide to... Like, let's say I find a guild that's not going to raid stupidly, but, you know, just a little casual guild once a week or something. Then I might do that, but I would absolutely do it as holy. Certainly for dungeon purposes, I'll go in as holy as well. In this particular situation, of course, to heal, because heals had pushback, then, like you can see there, I'll need to do that. But the other problem was the gear you got from raids. Of course, your best gear comes from raids, and your best, the best aspects of that was the tier armor. You know, those set bonuses. Now, those set bonuses were not really built with DPS in mind. There were a couple of aberrations, actually. But, for example, the first set in Molten Core, the Lightbringer set, didn't even have strength on it, as I recall. So, although, ironically, it had a bonus on it that might have been suitable. Oh, thank you very much. In fact, let's give them a little blessing. There you go. You can have wisdom. Because I had, you know, armour that was totally unsuitable for DPS, of course, I wasn't going to be doing any sensible DPS. And... compared to the classes that were designed for DPS, and their bonuses would give them bonuses, big bonuses to DPS as well. And then, you know, Judgment set was better. Judgment, I believe, I think there were a couple of forms of it, but I think that had strength on it. But the set bonuses weren't really brilliant for DPS. It was more healing in mind. They weren't useless for DPS, but they weren't great. Anchorage set actually was okay. You know, you could use that for DPS. And actually, even when you got into Naxxramas, if you're using the Anchorage set and you picked up some of the off pieces, there were some off pieces that were suitable for DPS as well for a Paladin. You could actually do good damage. And there was the odd guild that competed at this level and did raiding at this level that might have had a Retribution Paladin. And if they got themselves the right pieces, they would do well. I remember when we did Lower Theb in Nax. Now, that was a fight. It's very different to the Lower Theb in, you know, the tier, what is it, tier 7 version of Nax, because you could only basically cast a heal like once every couple of minutes, something like that. So everyone was set up for DPS. It was a huge DPS race, and that's what you set yourself up for. And I actually came top of DPS on that, you know. So you could absolutely do it if you were at a time, as it was when Nax was out, where you didn't have to do the buffing every 5 minutes, and you know, you were just focusing on DPS. You could totally do it. But it's not just that there's a lot of ifs to being able to do good damage as a Retribution Paladin. It's also that you're looking at the alternative. It's like, well, if we don't have you as a healer, we're missing out on a super awesome, particularly tank healer. Bloody brilliant for tank healing Paladins. But generally speaking, because if you looked at the 3 healers you had, because if you were playing a Paladin, you were Alliance. This is not available for Horde. Sorry for all you people that really like being Horde, but also really like being Paladins. If you play Classic WoW, you're choosing. But the bottom line is, Druids were throwing hots on everyone. They keep people topped up. They're not great in an emergency. It's not impossible to do something useful in an emergency, but they weren't great. They were there to just keep people ticking over. But then you had Paladins who were awesome at emergency healing, but also really good at that, because it was all single target. Flash of Light, Holy Light, you know, was all single target. Holy Shock, which was a talent at the end of it, which is a good one for doing on the move. If you had to move, like the Hagen dance phase, for example, on the move, throwing out the odd Holy Shock, it's the only healing you would be doing at that point. Anyway, unless you wanted to use your bubble, but who cares? If anyone was silly enough to get injured during that phase, that was their own lookout. But you also had another ability, because we've got these blessings here. So at the moment, the level I'm at, I've got Blessing of Might, I've got Blessing of Wisdom. I can only put one on any one person at a time, of course. But there's a few other blessings. One of them is Blessing of Light. Now, you put Blessing of Light on someone, and they take extra healing from any flash of light or holy light. So, in other words, you put that on your tanks, and every time a paladin heals them with flash of light or holy light, which virtually all the time is what it was, they're getting extra healing. So you were especially good in a raid environment. You know, it's in a raid situation. And that's the comparison there. You're looking at, you know, yes, you can do okay damage as a Ret Paladin. You can do competitive damage, as I recall. But at the same time, you can also be a brilliant bloody healer. And it's, what do you want to be? Do you want to be on par with the actual DPS classes and, you know, for your own enjoyment there? Or do you want to be a super awesome healer? And that's what it came down to. That's what it came down to for me. Because although I've been a committed Ret for many years in World of Warcraft, that's because when it became feasible, that's what I wanted to do. Ever since sort of late TBC, or mid TBC even. Because that's, you know, this character effectively is modelled on my Dungeons and Dragons character from like 30 years ago. And of course I wanted, you know, to model that, and that was in the vein of a you know, close combat DPS specialist. But during vanilla, it wasn't realistic. So that's how I would look at it. So obviously what I would be saying is, if you want to be Ret, ignore anyone who says you can't possibly DPS as Ret. It's nonsense. Yes, you can. And at this particular point in the patch, there isn't even the blessing argument against it. But put it this way, you'll get into more, if you plug in, you'll get into more groups as Holy. And also, even in your guild, they're not going to, you know, if you're in a raiding guild somehow, I don't know how it's going to pan out when it comes out. You're not going to have lots of Rets. A super committed one maybe, you know. But there's, you know, the compelling cases for most of you paladins to be Holy. But let's have a look at these talents anyway. Look at headline talents in the old Ret ones. We'll focus on the Ret ones, as this is a Ret vlog. So in terms of my choices as I go down, improved Blessing of Might, actually when I first started leveling, was where I put them in first. I thought, oh, well, I'm using this all the time, so I should go for the talents that buff it by a certain percent. But it's actually not a clever one to do, because at low levels it's not adding a massive amount. So a small percent on top of not a big amount of extra attack power is not really worth it. Eventually, of course, if you're going to be committed, yeah, sure. Because this can then work on warriors, it can work on rogues, it can work on hunters as well. Anyone who's going to be doing damage where it's buffed by attack power, including just from the point of view of the tanks, the warrior tanks, who are, you know, wanting to generate threat according to the damage they do. That's a really useful one to have at end game, but not, and that's even if you're Holy, you will take points in that. But that's not for leveling. Whereas this one, reduced mana cost of judgment and spells by 50%. Oh yeah, because mana is very tight. And when you're leveling, you're not really going to have much, if any, intellect gear. Your mana pool is determined by your level of intellect. So, And so here, of course, reduce the cooldown of judgment. It's the only bloody DPS button we've got, really. I mean, yeah, we use the seal, but that's to debuff. And then we apply whichever damage seal, which on this third row will be Seal of Command. But, oh god, that was a terrible bug there. But I should think that'll be fixed. It was fixed at this point in vanilla, I think, as well, anyway. But and that's it, you know. So you're just really waiting for judgment to come off cooldown, and that's if you've got access to your to enough mana to be able to use it. Otherwise, you would just auto-attacking anyway. Actually, that was one of the benefits of being a paladin, because at the time I had quite a low-level computer, 1 meg of RAM. It was not great. I used to lag a bit, you know. And so you could lag at this point, and it was okay. You go into a lag spike. You know, if I just stay here, it's going to take me much longer just to auto-attack it to death. The seal lasts 30 seconds, so that's not going to fade before this is dead. I only have to keep resealing because I'm judging normally. And it dies, and you get out your lag spike, and it's like, oh, sparkly corpse, I'll just loot it. And heal yourself up, and away you go again. So it wasn't actually a disaster. Not like a mage. If my mage had lagged up, that was a different matter. That was me in trouble then. So, yeah, that was one little advantage, I suppose. But we're not going to be experiencing that. A few other things you can get here. I mean, there's a parry chance one on there. You wouldn't obviously take that as a committed ret. Because, you know. Although there was a bit of off-tanking to be done in dungeons. That was definitely a useful skill. We didn't have a taunt for it or anything like that. But you could just grab something and then we'll kill that first and so on. While the tank grabs the other things and we get their targets later. Pursuit of Justice was somewhere. There it is. That came later on, but that's going to be there when the WoW Classic comes out. You know, some actual mobility. Wow. Yeah. Seal of Command will definitely want. Conviction, of course, because remember what I said about the importance of crit, and our talents give us access to crit. Of course, we needed that to be able to get the Vengeance, but, you know, only a fool would have gone for Vengeance, which is what we want, without taking those anyway. There was some fairly useless ones, eye for an eye, that came later as well. I mean, some of these you can miss out. Sanctity Aura, really useful. So quite a lot of good ones in there. But even in Holy, there was a few useful ones as well. So we can increase our strength by 2%. That's in the Holy one. So you wouldn't spend all your points in Ret. I don't think you... Could you even spend all your points in Ret? I suppose maybe you could. You certainly wouldn't. So the way I'd be looking at this, at level cap, if I was going to stay Ret for a little while, although I really would be going Holy quite quickly. But you're going to need the gear for Holy as well. You're going to actually need some gear. And that gear initially is going to be male gear, because the stuff you're getting from dungeons was really, with intellect on it, was for shamans. And leather workers could craft some intellect male gear. There was no intellect plate gear, really, until you were getting it from the raids, as far as I can remember. I can't be 100% on that, but I'm fairly sure it was all male. So there might be a little bit of a delay there, but you'd certainly be wanting that. You know, your total intellect as well would be really important for both DPS and healing, because remember, it buffed your mana pool as well as your spell crit, and some of these things are spells and it uses spell crit. It was a really weird system where Paladins, and this happened throughout a lot of TBC as well, where you've basically needed virtually all stats. You know, strength obviously increases the raw amount of damage your melee abilities do. Agility increased your crit, and we wanted crit. Intellect increased your spell crit, and as well as your mana pool, which was important, especially if you start getting silly things like, you know, consecration. Although that's not really a DPS ability, very low DPS. If against undead and demons, you get exorcism. You could use that. It only worked against undead and demons, as far as I can remember at the time. Exorcism went through a number of phases, though. I can't swear at what point it changed, so that it just did extra damage against undead and demons. I have an idea it wasn't during vanilla. And, you know, so... Obviously, protection, you won't go very far down there. Sometimes people, although this became a bit useless when Great Blessings came in, it won't even be there anymore, I wouldn't have thought, would it? There was, like, an improved Blessing of Salvation. Blessing of Salvation, really useful blessing, reduces threat. So that helps, you know, at a time when threat really did matter. People think, oh, threat matters again in BFA. Does it? Hell. But did in vanilla. And so by reducing the threat of everyone in the raid, apart from the tanks, then of course that was a really useful ability as well. So, yeah, that's where we're going for vanilla WoW, or classic WoW, whatever we're going to call it now. Like I say, what my plan would be to level as Ret, do maybe a little bit as Ret, get into a guild, of course, and not even trying to get into pucks as Ret. Although remember, the dungeons at the end, you could 10-man, you could raid them to get gear up first, because the dungeons were actually pretty tough in crap gear. So you could raid them to get gear, and then do them 5-man to do the quests, which is pretty good for a few things. But then I'd be going Holy at that point. As soon as I'd be collecting bits of Holy gear. In terms of professions, now I originally leveled up as a tailor enchanter. I'd probably do something different this time round. I wouldn't even rule out leatherworking and skinning, which might sound a bit odd, but for the simple reason that, as I say, for Holy purposes, it was really leatherworking that allowed you to get the gear that you would eventually use before you start getting it from the raids and stuff for healing. So those are my initial thoughts. First of all, nice little WoW classic themed Retvlog for this week. I'll be back with some live stuff, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks as well, as we start to look towards the 8.1 Azerite traits. But I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, share with other people who might also be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.